to welcome you all to the Nantasket Beach Lecture Series. I know a lot of you come every month, and we're very grateful for your attendance. The Nantasket Beach Lecture Series is put on by the Department of Conservation and Recreation, the Friends of the Hull Public Library, and the Hull Lifesaving Museum. Of course, because we're at the Nantasket Beach Resort, we're very thankful to have them put us up for our lectures every month. And I also wanted to take a moment to thank Greg Bennett from Hull Cable Access Television. He tapes all of these lectures, so if you have anybody who wanted to come tonight that wasn't able to, he posts all of the lectures up on the Hull Cable Access YouTube channel. So I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight. We are pleased to welcome Anthony Sammarco. He is a noted historian and author of 60 books on the history and development of Boston, although this evening you told me 70, so he's gone up 10 since I pulled this off of his Facebook site. So it's on the history and the development of Boston. He lectures wildly on the history of his native city. He commenced writing in 1995, and his books Dorchester, as well as The Baker Chocolate Company, A Sweet History, have made the bestsellers list. Since 1996, Mr. Sammarco has taught history at the Urban College of Boston, where he was named Educator of the Year in 2003, and where he serves on the Leadership Council. He had received the Bulfinch Award from the Doric Dames of the Massachusetts State House and the Washington Medal from the Freedom Foundation. He is a fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society, a member of the Boston Authors Club and the Boston Athenaeum. He is treasurer of the Victorian Society and a trustee of the Forest Hill Cemetery and Educational Trust. Quite the resume. If you have any questions about any of these activities that he does, or if you're interested in purchasing one of the books, Lost Boston, that he's going to be talking about this evening, it's on sale in the back of the room for $18.95. Also, was anybody at the Howard Johnson lecture? Yeah. I think at this point it was like 4 or 5 years ago. That was Anthony. That book is also on sale in the back for $20, and he'll be available to sign all of the books after the lecture. So please join me in welcoming Anthony Sammarco.
It's really a pleasure to be here. I think in a lot of times when we think of Boston history, we have to realize in some ways that Boston is an ever-evolving, ever-changing city. And in some ways, throughout the period of the 19th and early 20th century, the city really did change. If I could have the lights off, that'd be fantastic. Lost Boston was something that fell into my lap about a year ago. I got a telephone call from a publisher called Pavilion in London. They said they wanted to do a book on Lost Boston. And Lost Boston was to be a part of the City series. And they had already done books on Lost Chicago, Lost New York, Lost Detroit, Lost Baltimore, and while I was speaking with him, they said that they were editing Lost Las Vegas. So at that point I said, they have to have a book on Lost Boston. But the premise would follow suit on every single book that they would publish within their series. They had to have a photograph from every decade from the advent of photography in 1850 to the present of a building that had been lost. And it didn't necessarily have to be a building that was well known, but something that actually fit their criteria. It had to be albumen, which meant it was the highest resolution. It had to be horizontal, and it had to tell a story. So in a lot of ways, I thought, I love Boston history. I read it and study it every single day of my life. I teach it at the Urban College of Boston, but in a lot of ways, it was something that was probably one of the most difficult things that I've ever done. In some ways, I had to find buildings that were not only important, but also something that actually told a story. And Lost Boston, seen here on the cover, would tell the story of Union Station, which is now the site of North Station on Causeway Street, probably one of the most elegant buildings built by Shepley, Rutan, and Coolidge, and built in 1893 and would only survive for 40 years before it was demolished in 1927 to make way for not just the Boston Garden, but the new North Station. In some ways, Lost Boston starts in some ways that talks about a few buildings, 7 of which I think are the most important, but that I don't really go into great detail. One of the first is the old Feather Store, a building that was built in 1680 and would survive until 1860 at Dock Square. If you look to the right, you can actually see a corner of the Faneuil Hall. And the building itself, as you see here, was at that point called the Feather Store, but it was built as a residence by a man named Thomas Staniford. The building throughout the period of the 17th and 18th century would remain as a residence until it became a place where you purchased feathers for mattresses, bolsters, pillows, and things of that sort. And it would actually survive until 1860, until they actually had to demolish it with the widening of North Street, seen on the left-hand side. The building was antiquarian at the time, but Boston, in some ways, would look at this as something that, when it was demolished, it was something that was a great loss. Another building was Gleason's Publishing Hall that was on Tremont Street, directly opposite the Granary Burying Ground. Frederick Gleason was a German immigrant, but he actually started Boston's first illustrated weekly newspaper in 1848. Gleason's Pictorial Drawing Room Companion was probably one of the most popular papers in New England of the period. It didn't do just local history, but it also had such things as exotic stories of Hawaii or Russia or even the North Pole. And because it was illustrated in woodcut line illustrations, it was something that people looked forward to every single Friday. Well, he published it for over 40 years, and the building, as you can see here, was quite grand for a publishing hall, but it was something that would be demolished in 1865 to make way for the Horticultural Hall that would be there until 1901. Another building was the United States Post Office and Sub-Treasury that gave its name to Post Office Square in downtown Boston. This was actually begun in 1870. It was designed by Alfred Mullett, a federal architect, a man who would actually work in the United States and build upwards of 18 post offices throughout the country. This building actually stopped the Great Boston Fire of 1872 because of the granite that was being used. It was from Barry, Vermont. When it was completed in 1878, it was the grandest Victorian building in New England. And as you can see, it was quite grand. It survived until the 1920s. The federal government was giving interest-free grants to every city and town that would actually demolish their post offices. And in that instance, with a grant from the federal government, Boston decided to actually demolish this and build what became known as the McCormick Post Office, a Crammond Ferguson designed Art Deco building that still survives. And of course, even the cyclorama. And though it survives in the South End, it survives in a different guise. And this is the original rendition, designed by Cummings and Sears and built in 1883. The cyclorama was a circular building on Tremont Street in the South End of Boston. And when it was actually built to house a cyclorama of the Battle of Gettysburg. The cyclorama was 400 feet long and 9 feet high. And it depicted this battle of the Civil War that not only had fences and shrubbery and cannonade in the foreground, but with ample lighting was something that would recreate the war for your 25 cents. The only problem was that after you entered the crenellated entrance, it was something that didn't change after 2 visits, and it failed by 1880, and later it would actually become what became known as the Champion Spark Plug place where it was invented, and later the Boston Flower Exchange. We'd also see the Massachusetts State Prison, which was built in Charlestown. And this building, designed by Gridley J. Fox Bryant, was a very important building. It was on Prison Point, a part of Charlestown that you might hear today in basically the transportation news in the morning. The building itself was actually thought to be one of the most modern built in the 19th century. It housed over 400 inmates. And we saw it in the city of Charlestown, which was a city before it was annexed to Boston in 1874. And the building would survive right through to the period of the 1950s. At that point, the inmates were transferred to Walpole State Prison as well as Concord State Prison. The building was demolished and the land laid fallow until actually Bunker Hill Community College was built on its site. And of course, the great Boston Opera House. This was something that transformed Boston's Fenway. Just to the right would be Massachusetts Avenue. And on either side of Massachusetts Avenue was Boston's Symphony Hall and Horticultural Hall. Well, to the left on Huntington Avenue was the Opera House. Designed by Wheelwright and Haven, one of the premier architectural firms of the turn of the 20th century, this was where grand opera was performed, thanks to Eben Dyer Jordan Jr., the man who actually inherited the Jordan Marsh department store. Jordan was a very wealthy man, and he financed not just the building of the Opera House, but he financed the opera company. right through to the time of his death in 1916. Probably relieved that after his death, his family no longer took a financial interest, the Opera House itself would fail. And we saw in some ways in the 1920s and 1930s circuses, flower shows, and all sorts of different traveling troupes would perform in this building, a grand building that could seat 1,600 people. But by 1957, it was actually thought superfluous. Northeastern University bought it, demolished it, and put a parking lot on its site. And of course, the great Jordan Marsh department store. Does anybody remember Jordan Marsh? Do you remember the blueberry muffins? Well, that's my next book. Jordan Marsh, seen here, was actually started in 1851 by Eben Jordan and Benjamin Marsh, two partners that actually had the first department store in Boston. And that was something that actually had a store under one roof that provided everything from not just linens and fabrics, but clothing and trunks and furs and jewelry. It was something in a lot of ways that many people looked forward to, not only in the 19th century, but in the 20th century, when it became the largest chain on the East Coast. Seen here, the building at the corner of Washington and Avon Street was designed by Winslow and Wetherall, probably one of the premier architectural firms for commercial architecture. Their best-known buildings were the Baker Chocolate Company in Dorchester. The building itself would survive until 1979, when it was demolished to make way for a much more modern building, and eventually, a few years later, it was purchased by Macy's, and of course, Jordan Marsh was no more. And seen here in the downtown district, going to town was something that was really quite special in the 20th century. On the left-hand side was Jordan Marsh, in the center was Gilchrist's, on the right was Filene's department store, and of course Kennedy's, where a man bought his suit. Downtown Boston was something that was quite special before the advent of suburban shopping malls in the 1950s and 60s. And we see in some ways that whether one took the train or simply a bus into town, it was a place you could get everything you could possibly need. Transportation in this period was also something quite special. This was Sullivan Station in Charlestown, and maybe you remember the elevated railway. The elevated connected Charlestown with, eventually, Jamaica Plain at Forest Hills. And it was something that was built at the turn of the 20th century to alleviate traffic problems. At that period, you had not just pedestrians, horses, horse-drawn wagons, horse-drawn carriages, as well as streetcars that clogged the streets of Boston. As a result, there were traffic jams every day of the week. The elevated railway removed the train from this and put it above people on this basically girder-supported elevated railway. And it was so popular throughout the 20th century that for a nickel with the paper transfer, you could take a bus to one of these depots and then take the train into Boston. So whether you were traveling from Charlestown Sullivan Station into Boston or from Jamaica Plain into Boston, it was something of 17 minutes. It was a great aspect, but by 1989 it was demolished, and we see that today it's actually the Silver Line. Also, if you're as old as I am, maybe you got your driver's permit at the Registry of Motor Vehicles. And seen here, the building, this wonderful Art Deco structure, which was on Nashua Street in Boston, was adjacent to the area of the river in the foreground, the Charles River. You also see the dome of the Science Museum on the upper left-hand side. But this was an important feature because when it was demolished, it was made for a prison, which is still in its location. But all of these, in some ways, give credence to the fact of Boston changing in the 19th century. Boston had been settled in 1630 and would embrace a municipal city by 1822. In the early part of the 19th century, Boston was changing from a town to a city. And seen here with the old State House at the head of State Street, this is a painting from 1801 that's in the collection of the Massachusetts Historical Society. You see Boston as a town built of wood. But within a few years, it would transform itself into a city built of red brick, thanks to Charles Bulfinch. And Bulfinch, seen here in a portrait by Mather Brown, was not just a successful architect, but he was also someone who would actually change Boston, both architecturally as well as topographically. Bulfinch had been educated at Harvard. He graduated in 1786, and spent the next 3 years traveling abroad. When he returned to Boston, he brought a form of neoclassicism, a form of architecture we call American Federal architecture, which was symmetrical, very polished architecture. And he began to introduce it in new areas that not only he laid out, but also built the houses. And seen here, what we know today as Franklin Street, this was the area of the Tontine Crescent. On the right-hand side, there were 16 row houses that were connected, and these were the first connected row houses in all of New England. Bulfinch built these for the grand families of Boston between 1795 and 1796. And in the very center, you can see that it was what was basically known as neoclassical architecture. If you divided this directly down the middle and you folded it apart, you would actually see that it was perfectly symmetrical. The window placement, the pilasters, everything was similar. On the second floor of this pavilion was the Boston Library Society, which was something that was actually to become a part of the Boston Athenaeum. And in the attic was the first headquarters of the Massachusetts Historical Society. But if you look below, there was an archway that led through to Summer Street. After this building was demolished, that street became known as Arch Street, that connected Franklin and Summer Street. But Bulfinch was creating this type of housing for the new aristocracy of Boston. And between 1800 and 1819, when he left to go to Washington, D.C., he transformed the city not just through residences, but also through ecclesiastical structures. Now, Boston at this period had few Roman Catholics, but this was the first place of worship for Roman Catholics in Boston. Initially, it was the Church of the Holy Cross. It was on Franklin Street, just adjacent, as you can see, to the Tontine Crescent. The building itself was completed in 1804. It was a magnificent structure. But Bulfinch had built upwards of 19 individual churches throughout the city. He was also, in some ways, instrumental in laying out what is today Beacon Hill. And seen here, Beacon Hill at that time had only one house, and that was the home of John Hancock. Hancock was the first governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and he lived in this house that his uncle had built in 1737. But the whole concept was that after Hancock's death, his family began to sell off parts of the land to what was known as a group of investors of the Mount Vernon proprietors. And what they had Bulfinch do was to lay out new streets and build new houses. And during this period of time, looking from the steps of the Massachusetts State House down Park Street, it gives you an example of the houses built between 1800 and roughly 1815. On the far left-hand side is the Amory Tickner House. It was a private residence until the period of the 1880s. Today, it's Fox 25 News. Adjacent to it is the Union Club, and further down, leading to Park Street Church, were 8 individual row houses that Bulfinch completed in 1808. Anything that faced onto Boston Common was thought to be prime real estate, and we would see Bulfinch not only designing on Park Street, but Tremont and Boylston Street. And many of these houses, in some ways, were the epitome of elegance. But in the period of the 1830s, Beacon Hill was also being developed for new squares. Now today, there's a square on Beacon Hill called Lewisburg Square that still survives. But there was another square called Pemberton Square, seen here, which was laid out between 1833 and 1834. Today, Pemberton Square is the site of the courthouse. But on the right-hand side, you can see flat facaded buildings, but on the left, it was a very gentle arc of swell bay facade row houses. Pemberton Square was laid out. Many wealthy families, the Forbeses, the Perkinses, the Cushings, people who derived their wealth from the China trade, bought row houses here. The only thing was, though, by the 1860s, because of its proximity to Scollay Square that we'll see a little further on, it was something that began to change in its character. But during this period, it wasn't just the fact it would change in character, it changed because it went from residential to commercial. And seen here on Summer Street, which is today the site of Filene's department store, initially that was actually the site of Trinity Church. Trinity Church was the oldest Episcopal place of worship in Boston, and this was at the corner of Washington and Summer Street. By 1850, the downtown Boston area that Bulfinch had built up throughout the period from 1800 to 1820 was now changing, that by the period of the 1860s was completely commercial. And even here, these buildings that were designed by Gridley Bryant, a very well-known architect, were built on the site of the original Tontine Crescent. And you can see that the buildings still actually have that gentle curve, and Arch Street is on the right-hand side. But the surprising thing is, all of this would be swept away. In 1872, the Great Boston Fire actually destroyed 40 acres of downtown Boston's real estate. And we would see almost everything from Summer Street, Washington Street, Milk Street, and the waterfront being destroyed, with over 780 buildings. In that period, Boston would be rebuilt. And Boston would rebuild the downtown district not as a residential one, but as a completely commercial aspect. And seen here in a postcard of about 1890, this is Summer Street at the junction of Kingston. It gives you an example in some ways of what basically became one of the aspects of the original area of Boston that would be transformed into the area of banking and finance. Boston in this period decided to appoint a city architect by the name of George Clough. He would be the first of 11 city architects. They were appointed by the city council. And George Clough would oversee the rebuilding of the downtown district of Boston, here with 5- and 6-story buildings, now built of materials that were thought fireproof: limestone, brick, granite. But they also, in some ways, had party walls, which were fire walls. And in that way, Boston changed tremendously in the downtown district. Seen here in a map of the 1850s, Boston itself was changing topographically as well. And the original portion, the upper portion here, was an 800-acre peninsula, but the lower portion would actually be infilled in the 1840s and 50s for the south end of Boston, as well as the upper portion of the Back Bay in the 1860s to the 1880s. Boston was changing, and it was changing not just through matriculation, but it was changing through immigration. It was said that by 1850, that Boston was having over 10,000 immigrants on a monthly basis. Its population was swelling from the period of 1800 with 25,000 people to the time of the Civil War of over 150,000 people, of which fully 1/2 were either foreign-born or the children of foreign-born parents. In that instance, this land wasn't just to actually build upon, it was necessary because Boston's population demanded it. Well, one of the areas wasn't just the South End, but it was the Back Bay. And seen here looking west from the dome of the Massachusetts State House, on the right was actually Beacon Street, called the Mill Dam. When it was built in 1821, it actually dammed the Charles River on the right-hand side. And by damming the Charles River, it didn't allow a tidal flow of the river twice daily. And the Back Bay began to stagnate. And by stagnating, it not only bred mosquitoes, but it created what they called a noxious effluvia. It actually stunk. And it was not just something that had to be changed, but the city of Boston decided it was something that had to be done because it was a public nuisance. The Back Bay in that period would be infilled by a man by the name of John Souther, a man who had made his name in the Cuban sugar trade, who invented a Souther steam shovel. And he would actually infill the Back Bay with land brought from Needham, Massachusetts, 24 hours a day, 6 days a week for 40 years. And what they did was to fill in the marshes of Back Bay to create the new 19th century Back Bay. And seen here in 1875 at the junction of Commonwealth Avenue Mall and Dartmouth Street, you have to realize these houses were not sold one after the other. The land would be sold at auction. And of course, the land was shared equally by not just the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the city of Boston, and the city of Roxbury, but that the profits were equally shared by the three. And one of the things that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts did, which I think is commendable, is that they used their money for an educational fund. And during that period, they would actually found not only the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, but they'd also found the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In that instance, the sale of the land was something that would not only create a new district in Boston, but in some ways change Boston through education. Now, seen here, this is Arlington Street with the Arlington Street Church on the far left-hand side. It gives you an idea of what the Back Bay was envisioned as. It was a place of individual row houses built by extraordinarily wealthy families, and they were architect-designed buildings. But they shared what was called zoning, shared setback, height, building material, and design. And here, completed by 1860, was Arlington Street, one of the cross streets between Beacon Street and Boylston Street. And in that instance, the Back Bay began to attract people who would actually create not just a residential district, but also the people who would actually found museums and schools. And seen here at the corner of Berkeley and Boylston Street was the old Museum of Natural History. This was founded and opened in 1863 as a museum with a group of people who actually wanted to see everything from dinosaur eggs, skeletons of whales hanging from the third floor rafters, pieces of quartz where they studied. And it would survive right through to 1963 when it would move to Cambridge and become known as the Science Museum. Later, this building became Bonwit Tellers, Louis, a men's clothing store, and today it's Restoration Hardware, and it's been beautifully restored. It was designed by William Gibbons Preston, and it was the first of 3 buildings envisioned just on this one block. And directly behind it was the first headquarters of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Also designed by William Gibbons Preston, this was completed in 1865, and MIT, known as Tech in the 19th century, was a place that didn't educate young men in the field of liberal arts. In this instance, Tech was something that provided a degree in engineering, or the first school of architecture in the United States. And you began to realize in some ways that this was a building that had over 11 structures in the Back Bay before it would move to Cambridge in 1916. But the building would survive until 1937 as the School of Architecture, and at that point it was demolished to make way for the New England Mutual Life Insurance Company. But the whole idea was that William Gibbons Preston would actually induce this man to come back to Boston, and this was William Barton Rogers. Rogers was the first president of MIT. Between 1863 and his death in 1890, it sounds peculiar, but he raised over $7 million during that period of time, which was a tremendous sum of money to endow the school. And of course, with the buildings themselves, he was someone who became instrumental in showing people that they could educate the young men, and eventually by 1883, the first female student in things such as biology, chemistry, physics, as well as engineering and architecture. But we'd also see institutions such as the Boston Public Library. And this building, designed by Charles Kirk Kirby, was on Boylston Street, now the site of the Colonial Theater, opposite Boston Common. And when it opened, it was really instrumental in showing people that it was the first public library in the city of Boston. This building itself looks dour on the exterior. It was built of brownstone. It looks like it's a simple 2-story structure. But when you went in the door, you were greeted at Bates Hall. And Bates Hall was 3 stories in height, monumental Corinthian columns. This was endowed by a man named Joshua Bates, who lived in London. Bates had been raised in Weymouth, Massachusetts, and he was the American representative at Baring Brothers, a very important investment house in London. He gave $50,000 at the time, which was a tremendous sum of money, and they've named not only this Bates Hall, but the present Bates Hall at Scollay Square. Well, because the building was hemmed in on all sides with residences, there was no way to expand. And the trustees moved the library to Scollay Square, and this building would eventually be demolished in 1899 to make way for the Colonial Theater. But we'd also see the Museum of Fine Arts at Scollay Square. The museum was founded and opened on July 4th of 1876, the centennial of the United States. And this building by Brigham and Sturgis was thought to be Northern Italian architecture. They called it Venetian Gothic. And if you look, the windows with their pointed arches, and you notice in the dormers on the facade, It gives the impression of maybe the Doge's palace if you squint and cock your head to the left. But the Museum of Fine Arts, when it was built, was something that proclaimed that Boston finally had culture. This was a museum that actually began to collect not just local art, but also began to induce with Boston families to make donations. The interior was really quite interesting. In the early years, they were plaster castings of originals in both Athens and Rome. And if one didn't have the ability to go to Italy or Greece to see the originals, you could go to the museum for a quarter and basically take a tour. They really had very little original art until about 1880, when a man named Harvey Parker, who actually founded the Parker House Hotel, donated $100,000. And at that point, they began to buy Rembrandt etchings, something that is still in the collection. And in 1896, a man named Henry Pierce, who owned the Baker Chocolate Company, left $1 million to them in his will, and they acquired European art. Wonderful things. But the museum was something that would actually spur on the aspect of culture in Boston at the turn of the 20th century. But Boston also had wonderful hotels, and some of the early hotels were quite intriguing. This was actually the Mount Washington Hotel, and it was on Broadway in South Boston. When it was built in 1835, it was thought to be built in an area that was the new and up-and-coming part of the city. It had been annexed to the city in 1804 from Dorchester, and South Boston became an area of both residences as well as commercial structures along the harbor. But this was a building that had 100 rooms, every one of which had an ocean view. And because it had a horse-drawn omnibus that actually brought you for 12.5 cents from one town to another, it was something that people thought was really going to be successful. It failed in 1839. And at that point, it was sold at auction, and it was bought by a man named, of course, Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe. Howe was the founder of the Perkins Institution for the Blind. He had actually been in downtown Boston, and his school, which was the first of its kind to educate the blind, was something that had outgrown its original building. He induced Thomas Perkins, a man who was quite wealthy and derived his wealth from the China trade, to actually donate money. And he did. He gave $50,000. But he also gave the proviso that he had to actually see that money matched dollar for dollar. $50,000 in 1839 was a tremendous sum of money. And actually the ladies of Boston set about having bake sales and dances. And they also set up a kissing booth at Quincy Market. It's not recorded how much money the kissing booth actually brought in, but in 8 weeks they raised the $50,000 they needed. Samuel Gridley Howe, whose wife, of course, was Julia Ward Howe, the woman who actually composed the Battle Hymn of the Republic, would spend his entire career educating the blind. And we see the Braille system as something that was instrumental. This was located on Broadway, and it was there until 1911 when it moved to Watertown on the Charles River. And we see in some ways other hotels included the Tremont House, which was really and truly Boston's first grand luxury hotel. It not only had free soap, but it actually had the first toilets on Beacon Hill. It was at the corner of Tremont and Beacon Street, and it was something that not only had rooms that you didn't share with the next traveler, such as you would in an inn or a hostelry, but it was also something that served food 12 hours out of the day. It had grand reception rooms and a ballroom that actually could have 400 people. But the building would actually be taken apart in some ways by 1893, and a much larger office building built on its site. It was no longer elegant, and it was on a very main street. Other hotels, such as the Parker House, began to eclipse it. And Harvey Parker, who had started off as a man who would shoe your horses, would actually open a small oyster bar on Court Square. By the 1850s, he had a small hotel on School Street, and by 1876, when this was built, it was the largest hotel in Boston. And the Parker House not only had among the best dining rooms in Boston, but what is one of the things that you might think of when you think of the Parker House? Exactly, the Parker House rolls. they also created the dessert of Massachusetts, which is the Boston cream pie. And in that instance, Harvey Parker, this dour man who left $100,000 to the Museum of Fine Arts, was someone that he and his wife had no children. He sold his hotel the year before his death for $1.2 million. Sounds ridiculous today, but $1.2 million would transfer to about $25 million today. He had created in some ways a well-known hotel that still survives to this day, but it was replaced in 1927 by a present structure by Desmond and Lloyd. But the grandest hotel in Victorian Boston was the Hotel Brunswick. At the corner of Boylston and Clarendon Street, the Brunswick was a place that you went to and you wouldn't just have a room in the hotel, you would actually have a suite. Usually there was a bed sit, as they would call them, a sitting room with a bedroom or two bedrooms. Every sitting room had its own fireplace, but the Brunswick had one of the better dining rooms of the turn of the 20th century. It also had rooms that were called the Egyptian room, and everything was done in Egyptian revival motifs. It also had the Venetian room, with all of its chandeliers and wall sconces from Murano in Venice. In some ways, this was something that actually showed people what true luxury was all about. By the 1930s, it became a merchant marine hotel, and who survives, in some ways, thanks to Harvard University. After World War II, when the federal government offered a GI loan to educate the men and women who had served in the war, we saw Harvard buying the Hotel Brunswick for its married graduate students. And in that instance, with the GI loan, which was $90 a month, they not only could live quite nicely, but there was a Howard Johnson's on the ground floor. So if they didn't like the meal that Harvard was serving, they could at least have clam strips and French fries. But these were transient hotels compared to what were called residential hotels or French flat hotels. And this was actually the Hotel Pelham at the corner of what is today Boylston and Tremont Street. The Hotel Pelham was designed by Arthur Stone and built in 1857. And this was something that not only had the first elevator in Boston, the first central heat in Boston, but it was also something that attracted people who no longer wished to live in a 5-story row house. In this way, every floor was divided down the center, and one usually had a 10 to 12 room apartment, and in the attic places for one's servants. Of course, you can't go anywhere without your servants. The building itself was so elegant that this was where Isabella Stewart Gardner lived while she waited for her house to be built on Beacon Street in the Back Bay. It had a private dining room, a private library, a billiard room, all for the residents, and would survive until 1916 as a fairly comfortable hotel. At that point, it was demolished to make way for the Little Building that is on its site, which is now a dormitory for Emerson College. But the ideal of the residential apartments was the Warren, and this was in Roxbury at the corner of Warren Street and St. James Street, just up the hill from Dudley Street Station. When this was built, you could get anywhere from 7 to 12 room apartments. And it was something in some ways all on one level that made sense. It had an elevator, its own dining room. As you see, it also had an apothecary shop on the first floor, its own post office. And it was something that appealed. And by the period of the 1920s, a little saying said that these were for the newly married and the nearly dead. People who in some ways were either not having yet purchased their home or have downsized. And in some ways, this would actually proliferate the entire city, and we'd see these French flat apartments in the Back Bay and the South End, as well as all of the newly annexed suburbs, Roxbury, Dorchester, Brighton. But Boston was changing, and it was changing thanks to transportation. As I mentioned earlier, the elevated railway by 1899 connected Charlestown to Roxbury and would later in 1911 be extended to Jamaica Plain. Seen here at Dudley Street Station, a man by the name of Ernest Wadsworth Longfellow, a nephew of the great poet, would actually design these depots. And the depots were made of pressed copper, leaded glass windows. They were elegant, but you realized in some ways that for a nickel, you would take the streetcars on either side, from as far afield maybe as Upham's Corner, the trolley would bring you into Dudley Street Station on the loop. You'd actually then enter the train to go to Boston, all for a nickel and a paper transfer. And in 17 minutes, you were in downtown Boston. Elevated railway made it ease of transportation. So living in the suburbs, which the suburban neighborhoods really were, was something that allowed people to have a lawn and green space. It wasn't just trains, it also included the penny ferries that connected Boston and East Boston. And seen here in 1920, these ferries, which went from the crack of dawn until 1 o'clock in the morning, were an important feature. And for a nickel, you could actually travel by the period of the 1920s. There are so many people there because they were actually taking the trolley to East Boston to take the narrow gauge railroad to what was called Revere Beach, the first public beach in America. And that was an important feature, so it wasn't just used by residents, but it was also used by people taking what is today the Blue Line. So we have trolleys as well as the ferry. We also had the East Boston Airport, and this in 1927 was a one-strip landing place that actually would develop in the period of the 40s into what became known as Logan International Airport. Well, this was a photograph of Dedication Day. You see the stand and all of the officials in the foreground. But you began to realize in some ways that this was something that was transforming East Boston into what today many people think of as when they think of East Boston. The unfortunate thing was, though, you began to see East Boston spreading in such a way with the airport that it was taking over the entire town. And here, by 1945, it was renamed for Edward Logan. Does anybody know who Edward Logan was?
World War I general?
He was Spanish-American, and he was a colonel in the Spanish-American War, which sounds important, but he never distinguished himself. He was the presiding judge of the South Boston District Court, so I think he might have been extremely well connected politically. Otherwise, we might have the Kennedy International Airport. But this was something in a lot of ways that would expand, and today it's under the auspices of Massport. Transportation was an important feature, but so too wasn't the aspect of entertainment. And entertainment seen here on Washington Street in downtown Boston was something that was quite intriguing. And though this was a daytime photograph, you can imagine what it was like in the evening with the marquees actually illuminated with colored lights. Going to town either for shopping or dining, or in this instance for entertainment at B.F. Keith's or the Adams House or the Opera House, was something in a lot of ways that many people looked forward to. Entertainment went in many different guises. In this instance, it was Braves Field. I don't know if anybody remembers Braves Field. The Braves was one of two baseball teams in Boston. I can't remember the name of the other team, but I think they're still in existence. But Braves Field was located on the old Alston Golf Club, if you can imagine Alston having a golf club. It was on Commonwealth Avenue, and it would survive from the period of 1916 right through to 1953. The Braves was a fantastic team, and you can see that the stadium itself was really quite nice. Thousands of people would take the streetcars, either from Brighton or from Park Street to this place, and descend for the wonderful games. Unfortunately, it was demolished, and today is the site of Agganis Arena at Boston University. You might have also gone to Marine Park in South Boston. And seen here, this is actually the old head house designed by Edmund March Wheelwright. It was built in 1893. It was a beautiful structure, but it was something that had two restaurants, an ice cream stand, but if you notice on the right-hand side, cabanas for people to change into bathing costumes, because bathing in the sea was something by the turn of the century that was quite new and novel. The building itself was really quite gorgeous. This area of Marine Park was developed by the city of Boston, and this was on the far edge. But adjacent to it was the area of the old aquarium. Now, Boston had an aquarium as early as the 1850s on Bromfield Street in downtown Boston. But by 1912, this was actually designed by William Austin, a very well-known architect, but it was something that had 40 individual tanks that held hundreds of gallons in each individual tank. for exotic fish. Well, during that period of time, this was something that attracted not only adults, but children by droves. Opened in 1912, it was something under the auspices of the city that was not only a great attraction, but for a streetcar nickel, you could come from downtown Boston. And seen here with the children, and this is a photograph from the 1940s, you began to realize that day trips were really quite important. After the war, unfortunately, the city of Boston did not really invest much money in it. Not only did it begin to smell because the water was not circulating, nor was it really maintained, it began to fall into an abeyance. And it was closed in 1955. A man by the name of Robert Lowell, who was a very well-known poet, wrote this little ditty, and he said it was for the Union Dead, and it talked about all sorts of things in Boston. But it had this one little segment on the aquarium. And it said that the old South Boston Aquarium stands in a Sahara of snow now. Its broken windows are boarded. The bronze weather-vane cod has lost half its scales. The airy tanks are dry. Once my nose crawled like a snail on the glass. My hand tingled to burst the bubbles drifting from the noses of cowed, compliant fish. My hand draws back. I often sigh still for the dark, downward, and vegetating kingdom of the fish and reptile. Unfortunately, it was closed in 1955 and would be demolished in 1961 to make way for an MDC skating rink. And it wouldn't be for another 25 years that an aquarium was built in Boston, and at that point in downtown Boston. But this whole aspect of transportation as well as entertainment was something that really intrigued people. One of the things at Franklin Park was the Elephant House. When I was a child, this was my greatest joy. Every Sunday we would simply take a walk and have a picnic at Franklin Park. The Elephant House was also designed by William Austin, built in 1912, and here a man by the name of Waddy lived. Waddy was one of 3 elephants. He was actually an African elephant, and he's actually getting a manicure by his keeper. These 3 elephants were an intriguing aspect of exotic animals for inner city children to see in the teens and 20s of the century. The Elephant House, unfortunately, was demolished in 1979 when Franklin Park really had no money to maintain it. So a lot of these exotic animals were brought to both the Providence Zoo as well as the Stone Zoo in Stoneham. But we'd also see the Reedville Racetrack. And if you know Reedville, it's now a neighborhood within Hyde Park. Originally, Reedville was an area that was separate from the city and wouldn't join until January 1st of 1912. But in 1898, the Reedville Trotting Park was laid out for men to actually race their horses on one-seated sulkies. Now, this was on a spur of the Boston and Providence Railroad, so it was very simple to get to. And you began to realize these gates themselves looked very nice, but the grandstands seen in the distance could seat thousands of people. In the foreground, these were one-seated sulkies, and in many instances, there were 27 individual driving clubs in Boston. The Dorchester Gentlemen's Driving Club was the one that my grandfather belonged to, and they would normally race their family horse. This is something at the turn of the 20th century, and many people still had horses, even in Dorchester. But here, it was an important feature because they'd race to win a silver loving cup. And each one would go from one place to another. And of course, the Reedville Trotting Park was the grandest of all of them. But the whole aspect was, by 1925, this was something that saw the horses now becoming quite scarce. This became the Reedville Racetrack for automobiles. And by 1937, it was the Stop and Shop warehouse that survived here until it moved to Plainville about 10 years ago. We'd also have as entertainment Scollay Square. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands of anybody who remembers or even patronized Scollay Square, but Scollay Square was the red light district of mid-20th century Boston. And seen here looking from what is today Court Street, on the right-hand side is Boston City Hall Plaza. This was a place that was said that there was something doing 24 hours a day. And during the period of both World War I and World War II, it seemed like every sailor walked in Boston arrived at Scollay Square within a few moments. Scollay Square was named for William Scollay, a man who actually regulated all of the stagecoaches coming into Boston in the late 18th and early 19th century. But it was also a place that was quite polite in the early part of the 1840s and 50s. One of the places was a place of worship, and we eventually saw it becoming the Old Howard, but this was actually the Millerite Temple. And it was a place that was under the auspices of a man named the Reverend William Miller. And in the 1840s, he had a group of followers who believed that the world would end on a specific date. As a result, they prepared for their ascension to heaven. They sold their property, they gave Fluffy away to relatives that weren't members of the church, and they basically went to church and sat in their pews awaiting the day. Unfortunately, the day came and went, and after a few days, people were a little bit miffed that they weren't in heaven. They were able to sell the property, and they sold it to a group that renamed their place of worship the Old Howard. The Old Howard in the 1850s and 60s was very good. I mean, it had Shakespearean plays, and they had all sorts of different acts that were quite nice. But by the 1890s, this became burlesque. And burlesque was something in a lot of ways that many people looked at that was a little risque. In some ways, this is quite an artistic pose, but Sally Rand was someone who was known as the queen of the fan dances. I wonder if she got her fans at the old feather store, but the whole idea is her feathers were quite artistic, and she would actually spend 30 years of her life dancing before besotted men. The Old Howard was something that also had a very well-known woman, Anne Corio. And Anne Corio spent 40 years of her life dancing at the Old Howard. She was beloved, not only by men, but women, because she was someone who really seemed to enjoy not just dancing, but the fact that she could twirl her tassels without even moving. She also has a claim to fame that she was an honorary member of the class of 1937 at Harvard. And in a lot of ways, we began to realize that these two women, Sally Rand and Anne Corio, Gypsy Rose Lee, and many other women, would actually perform in some ways in a place that was a temple of burlesque. Well, seen here, it was a place that had all sorts of things. By midnight, you began to realize it would close at 1 o'clock, but the dances were incredible. Well, by 1950, people looked at this as something that was really out of control. And they closed it. And they said in a lot of ways that it was something that was done because the New England Watch and Ward Society declared it to be immoral. So when it was closed, a man by the name of Frank Hatch wrote this little ditty. And he said that Boston has two Athenaeums, both on Beacon Hill. One is for scholars with books by the score, the other for lads who seek life in the roar. The Boston Athenaeum's lights are bright, but the Howard Athenaeum's locked up tight. Some purist got himself a juris and slapped a padlock on the door. Some coward closed the Old Howard. It was closed for 11 years, and in 1961, at the height of urban renewal in Boston, it burnt to the ground as over 1,000 men with a tear on their cheek watched it burn. Well, in a lot of ways, Lost Boston is a compilation of 69 individual essays on buildings between 1850 and the present that were destroyed either by urban renewal or simply out of fashion or by fire. And in a lot of ways, it's something that begins to chronicle that we can't save everything in the city, but we can actually preserve them either in a basic format of a photograph or in a book called Lost Boston. This was a lot of fun to write, and I began to realize that when I did this, it wasn't just a labor of love, but it was also preserving a part of our history and evolution of the city of Boston. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.